Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Touch. Every touch is a step forward. By Dexcom, take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom. And by No Foods, no grain, no gluten, no guilt.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, it's back to school, and for a lot of parents, that can mean back to confusion. What do you really need to help keep your child safe at school, preschool, and daycare?
I think it's important for parents to have a clear understanding of their child's legal rights and also the child's level of independence.
An in-depth conversation with Crystal Woodward, director of the American Diabetes Association's Safe at School program, and the mom of a daughter who was diagnosed with type 1 at age 1. She's all grown up now. Plus, a ready-to-use Glucagon pen goes to the FDA. What would the first room temperature stable liquid glucagon mean for us? This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. So glad to have you here. We aim to educate and inspire about type 1 diabetes by sharing stories of connections, talking to the movers and shakers in our community, as well as the healthcare companies and tech folks who are trying to push this all along, and the advocates and the helpers like we're doing today, the organizations that are there to protect us and help educate not just people with diabetes, but people without diabetes who really need to learn. Because, as in this case, we're talking about school, they're taking care of our kids. My son was diagnosed with type 1 just before he turned 2, and I'll be talking about that today because he went right back to daycare way back when. And, it was not easy, but we did it. Both of my kids were in daycare at the time of Benny's diagnosis. My husband and I both worked full time, and it took a lot of education and it took a lot of trust. But we definitely got it done. But I remember those days, and I certainly remember sending Benny to kindergarten. And believe it or not, even after 3 years in daycare/preschool, I was so nervous. That was the most stressful time for me since diagnosis, probably. Now, it turned out great. We had a very supportive elementary school, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But please know that 99% of the time, it really does work out just fine. And yeah, there are problems. There are ignorant people. There are power people who just feel like they need to be in charge. But hopefully today, we can help you have some of the tools to work around that. And at the very least, know your rights and what your child is entitled to. There's a lot of information out there. Thank you so much. I have to thank you as you listen, because for the third year in a row, we made it to the final slate of the podcast awards. If you saw the Facebook Live I did the other day, we announced this, and you can go back and watch that video if you want to. We were talking about the podcast awards is also called People's Choice. It is for independent podcasters like me, like Diabetes Connections. And the annual contest has listener voting for several months. And then they announce the top 10 slate in each category. We are in the top 10 for health, which is so exciting, third year in a row. And from now on, it is up to the judges. In the past, they have had more voting, but that is done. And I'm really happy about that because honestly, it is such a pain to ask you. I don't want to do that, to vote every day for something online. You get enough spam in your email. So now a big panel of judges, it's like 1,500 people, will vote on the finalists in each category, and we'll know that at the end of September. So thank you for your support. Really appreciate that. And it is so fun to see our show up there with some of these big names. And of course, it's an ego thing. I mean, that's fantastic. But I really hope it also helps more people find the show so that more people hear these stories and hear this information. And that's really one of the big reasons why I do it. All right, on to Safe at School in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Touch. One Touch has been a trusted brand in blood glucose management for more than 30 years. This past year, Pharmacy Times and U.S. News & World Report named One Touch as a #1 pharmacist recommended brand in blood glucose monitoring devices based on a survey of pharmacists nationwide. Find out more about One Touch brand products at diabetes-connections.com and click on the One Touch logo. My guest this week is here to help us out when it comes to working with your school. and that can be elementary or higher, public or private, preschool, and even daycare. Now, we're going to focus on daycare for the first part of the interview and elementary school a bit later on. I do think that daycare is really important to focus on. It seems like a very fuzzy area, and there have been some changes and some lawsuits in the last couple of years to catch you up on. Crystal Woodward is the director of the American Diabetes Association's Safe at School program. Her daughter, who was diagnosed at age 1 27 years ago, is now an independent adult. And as you'll hear, she is an ICU nurse. We did talk to Crystal almost 2 years ago about Safe at School, mostly focusing on elementary and middle school. I will link that episode up in the show notes. Most of the information has not changed. As you'll hear, there are some updates that we talk about today, but I urge you to go back if you want a little bit more in depth on older kids. And another quick note here. I apologize for some confusion I think I may cause during the interview. I mentioned how we didn't have a 504 plan going into kindergarten. We certainly didn't have one in daycare. And in my district, we have a specific medical plan for children with diabetes. A lot of schools have this. It is called the DMMP, the Diabetes Medical Management Plan. And we will talk about that in the interview too, but later on. And the DMMP covers what many of you may have to put into a 504. Access to bathroom, access to water, where blood sugar checks will occur, where insulin dosing will occur, that kind of thing. In our area, a 504 plan is really only used for testing, and not this week's spelling test, but, the end of the year tests, the end of grade tests, as you get older, those big quarterly tests. And of course, Benny didn't need to worry about that in kindergarten, but I do apologize for any confusion because the 504 is your federal right. And I don't want anyone to think that you don't need one. It's up to you if you want to get it, but there are separate things that we talk about here, and I will outline them in the show notes as well. Here's my interview with Crystal. As I said, we first talked to her about 2 years ago about school issues. Crystal, thanks for coming back on the show. Always great to talk to you about these issues. I appreciate your time. Thanks.
Good to be here, Stacey. This is a busy time of year, so we've got a lot of important information to cover.
No doubt. And I want to talk about a lot of 504 plan basics, back to school, elementary school, middle school, high school, that sort of thing. But I thought we could focus a little bit more on daycare this time around. I'm seeing a lot more questions, a lot of concern about as I hate to say it, it seems like children are being diagnosed younger and younger about putting them in daycare, an experience that we had, and I'll share a little bit more about. But can you go through some of the basics? Talk to us about daycare. What do parents need to know?
Sure. Well, daycare, first and foremost, there are some unique challenges, as you well know, for the young child. There are a lot of children enrolled in daycare throughout the country, and one of the differences between a young child in daycare and a student with diabetes in the school setting is that these younger children are 100% most of the time dependent on adults for all of their care. So when our children are very young and they're nonverbal or they're newly diagnosed, they are going to be 100% dependent on that adult for care. Also, kids have limited communication and motor skills and cognitive abilities, and their emotional maturity is different for the young child. So for the child with diabetes in daycare, it presents some challenges both for the parents and the providers. For example, with hypoglycemia or hyperglycemia, the child may or may not exhibit abnormal behavior or irritability. The provider might think that, erratic behavior, irritability is normal for that age group when it could, in fact, be hypo or hyperglycemia. Also, some other challenges that we recognize are language barriers, ethnic and cultural practices, limited resources in daycare, limited support. The geography impacts daycare. Is it a rural setting? Is it an urban setting? The health literacy, all of these things must be considered in developing certainly a care plan for the child with diabetes. Another challenge we see in the daycare setting sometimes is staff turnover. and the challenges in ensuring that all trained staff members are available, and even that the key staff members have some training. So, the child care program has to be prepared to provide that care to that child, and the parents and the child's providers can play a pivotal role in partnering with the child care staff. So
yeah, but even
that's really critical.
Sure. Even before we get to that point and all of those questions, what about is my daycare obligated to take my child back? Or, we hear often that some daycares will say, no, we don't want a child with type 1. Right.
So there's a federal law called the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, and a question that we do often get is, does ADA apply to child care centers? And the answer to that is yes. Even privately run child care centers are places of public accommodation, just like private schools or recreation centers, and they must comply with Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then child care services that are provided by a government entity or agency like Head Start, they have to comply with Title II. But just know that child care centers must comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, the only exception to that are going to be those centers that are actually run by a religious entity, such as churches, mosques, or synagogues. And the activities by the religious organizations are not covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Another point to note is that we realize that some private child care centers may be operated out of a church. So sometimes we get the question, do those centers who are operated in a church, do they still have to comply with ADA? And the answer to that is yes, because the program's not controlled by the religious organization. The child care is just renting space from that religious organization. So even, if the child care center pays rent to the church and if there are no other connections to the church, the program has to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act.
But what about what we call private daycares that take no federal funding, that are not religious? Are they accepted as well?
Yes, they still have requirements under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Yes.
So yes, that they cannot kick a child out, they can't refuse to treat a child if they're...
They cannot discriminate. Private-run daycare centers, they're places of public accommodation, just like private schools, and they can't discriminate.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you to dive a little deeper in that if you can, because when you say they cannot discriminate, we've heard so many times where a place would say, I can't give insulin. I can't, I will not treat a low. Mm-hmm. Is that considered discrimination, or is that considered some kind of medical care that they don't have to provide?
Well, my advice is going to be for the parent to consult with an attorney if there's those kinds of questions. But generally speaking, unless the child poses some kind of direct threat, the child care center who either refuses to enroll the child, period, or refuses to give the insulin, that could be seen as discrimination and in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the other thing I want to point out is that there must be an individualized assessment that considers the child. In other words, a daycare center can't say we're not taking any children with diabetes. There has to be an individualized assessment for that child with diabetes or other disability.
There was a recent lawsuit, or there was a settlement, really, in March of this year. The Department of Justice settled with Learning Care Group, and this is an umbrella organization that includes Le Petit Academy, lots of other big names. I know you're familiar with it, but just for the listeners, it's an umbrella organization that covers a lot of private groups: Le Petit Academy, Child Time Learning Centers, Tutor Time, Montessori Unlimited, Creative Kids Learning Center, and they basically told them that they were violating the Americans with Disabilities Act. They needed to provide children with adequate means for diabetes management. What does this mean going forward for daycare centers and parents? right back to Crystal on that. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. And you know when you have a toddler diagnosed with type 1, first of all, it is crazy town. So kudos to you if you are dealing with a toddler with type 1. If you haven't been there, it is something special. But you do hear rumblings for a long time about the teen years. Well, that hit us at full force a little earlier than I expected, really around age 11. Benny's insulin needs started going way up, and I was so glad we had the Dexcom because he's grown, I think 7 inches in the last 3 years, maybe more. And along with the hormone swings, I can't imagine managing diabetes without the Dexcom continuous glucose monitoring system. Benny now wears a size 13 shoe. This is crazy pants. We can react, crazy shoes. We can react more quickly to highs and lows, see trends, and adjust insulin doses with advice from our endo. I know the Dexcom G6 mobile now is helping to improve Benny's A1C and overall health. And you will hear more about using remote monitoring at school and some guidelines from the ADA coming up. For more information, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. Now back to Crystal talking about a recent Daycare diabetes lawsuit.
Well, we know this is a very important development, but also, unfortunately, it's a settlement and it's not controlling law. So it can't be used for legal precedent. But we do think it's a good sign of what the federal government interprets the law to require. Also, in this particular settlement, my understanding is that the Learning Care Group had to pay each of the 8 families $10,000 in damages. I think that's quite unusual. But basically, my understanding of the settlement is that the Learning Care Group agreed to provide necessary assistance to children with diabetes and that it could be provided by a lay person, and that they agreed to train child care staff members to assist with routine tasks like insulin. And found those to be a reasonable modification under the Americans with Disabilities Act.
I think the hardest part here for parents is we have a kid. My child was 23 months old when he was diagnosed. He was in a daycare setting, as was his older sister, and we were able to put him back in about a week later because someone there knew the very basics, and then they kind of knew more than we did at the time, and we were able to educate ourselves, educate them, and then as time went on, educate more and more people so that when that one person wasn't there, everybody knew what they were doing. But as a parent with your tiny little kid, you're already freaking out about diabetes. The last thing you want to do is push for a child to go somewhere where they are not welcome, or you feel they're not welcome, right? They may want to help, the staff may want to help, but the management may say no, things like that. Is there an easy way to find out what your rights are? I mean, you mentioned earlier we'll talk to an attorney. Is it really that different state by state, or is it city by city?
Well, there are federal laws, and of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act is a federal law, and then each state will have regulations that govern what the child care providers must do. So definitely check with state laws. If you go to our website on diabetes.org/childcare, there are some links to some helpful child care resources, and these are geared for the care of younger children with diabetes in the child care setting. Especially, I would especially look at the association's position statement on the care of children with diabetes in the child care setting. We have a diabetes medical management plan, which is essentially a health care plan that the child's provider can fill out and sign, and that plan is going to contain the prescribed care for that child in the child care center. But I really think the key is education. Perhaps the child care center has not had an enrollee with diabetes in its history or in its recent history. So lots of times there's just fear and there's a misunderstanding about diabetes, and there's lack of information and a miscommunication about what is expected of that child care center. And I think that's where the parent can really help to ensure that their child is able to safely attend and enroll in the child care center. The parent should work closely with that center, perhaps bring in the child's diabetes provider or diabetes educator in to do a training. The other way that I've seen child care providers trained is to reach out and to be included in a local school district training, because at a minimum, by attending, the school district training, child care staff will learn, how to give insulin and how to give glucagon and some of the basics behind all of that. So that's often when we receive calls from child care centers who are looking for resources to train, or we receive calls from parents. We advise parents to work closely with that center, but also to explore the resources in their own community, such as school districts. And the pediatric diabetes centers many times will have programs for child care providers, or will be willing to come in to give that provider some training.
Yeah, we were very fortunate. Our JDRF and local Peds Endo practice teamed up several years ago. Now, this is, how old is Benny? This is probably 10 years ago. But they had a training that we paid for two of the care providers to go to. We kind of paid them like a babysitter rate and said, would you just, take time out of your weekend and go to this? And it really helped because the manager was a former medic, and she knew, like I said, she knew a little bit about what she was doing, but nobody else did. And it was a question of, it was really nice of them, frankly, to go out of their way. They didn't have to do that. Before we move on to elementary schools and back to school, can you give us just the bullet points of what has to be done if you bring a newly diagnosed child to a daycare facility? What do they have to do for you?
Well, I can tell you what the association recommends, and all of the care provided should be consistent with that diabetes medical management plan that I spoke about a few minutes ago. But they should be willing to learn about all the basics of diabetes management, understand what makes blood sugars go up, what makes blood sugars go down, have an understanding of the whole juggling act that you and I as parents are very well versed in. And we need to make sure that the daycare providers are trained. And I think that's part of the question, part of the answer to the question is the training, and what should they know how to do? Well, they should know how to perform blood glucose monitoring. They should know how to administer insulin. They should know how to administer glucagon. They should know how to do urine and or the blood ketone checks as needed. Certainly, at a minimum, the providers need to know how to recognize and treat hypoglycemia, because that's always the most immediate urgency for our kids who take insulin, is the fear of hypoglycemia. Also, they should have a basic understanding of carbohydrate counting and monitoring the carbs. So those are just some bare bones things. I just want to reiterate that the child care center should not deny admission on the basis of a child having diabetes, and that it's important for the parent to work with the provider, first of all, to write a diabetes medical management plan or an order that will be implemented in the child care setting, and then to work with that child care staff to make sure the staff receives the training that the staff needs. And ideally, this training would be provided to a small number of the child care staff. And there should be, just like the school setting, there should be, at least one person available at all times who has been trained to provide diabetes care to the child.
And not to continue to hammer this home, but I guess I was asking less about what a parent should ask in terms of care and what a parent should ask in terms of legality. Because I'm telling, I know we were talking about, hey, they're not allowed to discriminate, but every day we see in Facebook groups, and I hear from people all the time, this daycare center does not want my child, or this daycare center is asking me to come every day and administer insulin. So what steps do parents take if the daycare center is telling them we are allowed to discriminate when you're telling them they're not?
Right. Well, I would say, the same protocol kind of applies as we use in the school setting, to make sure that the child care provider, first of all, make sure you're talking to the owner of the manager of the child care center. And I'd like to start out by not just educating about diabetes, but also making sure the provider understands their obligations under federal and state laws, because lots of times this just isn't the case. Also, I think, too, it's how the parent approaches the child care center. I mean, you don't go in there with your fist clenched. We're in this together, and we're in it to make sure the child is safe and that the diabetes needs are met. But I would say if there are difficulties, please give the American Diabetes Association a call, first of all, at 1-800-DIABETES. We have people here who can provide information and guidance on federal and state law rights of children with diabetes in the child care center, and we can also provide some direct strategies for helping to resolve the issue. And hopefully a little education and negotiation will go a long way, but if that doesn't work, there may be a point in time when the parent needs to reach out for legal assistance. So that would be a next step. Also, the parent should consider calling the state agency responsible for overseeing child care. There might be some resources or help that the parents can obtain from that state agency.
That's great. I really appreciate that, because I know you've kind of said it a couple times, but it really, we just need to keep, we need to keep hearing it. We need to continue to let people know what the information is. So I do appreciate you going over that again. All right, so let's move on to elementary school, because back to school, I'll be honest with you, kindergarten was terrifying. And my son had already been diagnosed for several years. He knew exactly what he was doing. I mean, he could use his pump with supervision and check blood sugar, but I was still so scared because it's a new environment, it's new people, there's more independence, even for kindergartners. So what do you tell parents when they're starting school, real, quote-unquote, real school?
Well, what I tell parents, I kind of have a checklist, and the first thing I tell parents, either after their child is newly diagnosed or their child's going to school for the first time, is I think it's important for parents to have a clear understanding of their child's legal rights. I think it's important that the parent communicate with the child's provider to determine just, what kind of services are going to be needed at school, and also the child's level of independence. I mean, you mentioned that your child was independent at an early age. My daughter, too, she was diagnosed when she was a year old. So by the time, she got into preschool, she was able to do her own finger sticks. And certainly by the time she was in kindergarten, this is before the age of pumps and such, she was able to give her own insulin injection. So every child is different. And I think the more we can do to educate the educators about diabetes, and also the school's obligation under federal and state laws to provide certain services, the better off we'll be. I think parents need to they need to have reasonable expectations. There is a reasonable expectation that comprehensive care will be provided at school in accordance with the child's level of independence, but I think we need to be also realistic. I always tell parents to ask for the universe, but expect the world. So we need to be well-grounded, but understand the laws, be prepared to understand, be prepared to explain the laws to educators. Important to get in with that school nurse early. As back to school is a busy time. So once those teachers and school nurses are back at school, my advice would be to sit down with the school nurse as soon as possible and to have those doctor's orders or that diabetes medical management plan with you so that you can review those plans and orders with the school nurse. Another important undertaking for going back to school, we're as parents, we're all focused on getting the new backpack and getting the new lunch box and the new clothes. But Yeah, as a parent of a child with diabetes, we have a lot more homework than that. And, part of that, too, is bringing in the supplies and sitting down with the school nurse and making sure that there are, all the necessary supplies. And another important undertaking is when parents sit down with the school nurse, we want to try to decide who at school should be trained, because not every school, in fact, most schools do not have a full-time school nurse. Many schools share a nurse, or many schools have a part-time nurse. So when we sit down with that school nurse before the beginning of the school year, we want to talk about, specifically about how diabetes care should be delivered in the school setting and what that looks like. But we also want to talk about what kind of training the school nurse and or a diabetes educator is going to provide to school staff, because there should always be somebody on the premises who has been trained to provide diabetes care in accordance with the provider orders. So that's the first step. Let's take care of the diabetes needs, and let's make sure the school nurse understands. Let's make sure that we know what the next steps are in terms of training people. Those are huge. Mm-hmm. And then if the child does not have a Section 504 plan, now a Section 504 plan is a written plan developed for those students who are eligible for services under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And that is Section 504, as it's referred to. Section 504 is a federal anti-discrimination law that prohibits entities from discriminating against people on the basis of disability. And diabetes is a disability under the definition of disability, which is a disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So once you kind of have the medical side squared away with the school nurse, then it's time, or actually simultaneously, it's time to reach out to the school's 504 coordinator to initiate the 504 process.
And I'm just going to jump in. I just want to jump in real quick. As you're listening, just as a real life example, we were always able to meet with the nurse, even if it was just a couple of days before school, which I got to tell you that first year really made me nervous. Mm-hmm. But, we didn't have we only had a part-time nurse, so I had to go in just a couple of days before school, and I didn't even get to really sit down with the teacher until the day before school. But we did not do the 504 until at least a week, I want to say almost a month into the school year, because of we were in a very large school district, the way the appointments went, and it was okay. It was very much okay. Now, part of that is because my child was in kindergarten, and in our school district, the 504 plan mostly covers testing. That's what they mostly use it for. But we were able to talk to the nurse and the teachers and the staff and kind of get the routine down. And the 504 plan came later, may not be by the book, but just as a real life example, it really turned out okay, just to reassure some parents who may be listening. So go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Crystal.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, I don't want parents to hear this and think, oh, my goodness, we've got to get that 504 before the first day of school. In all honesty, that rarely happens.
Right.
I mean, my own daughter's 504 plan, it took us 6 months. So,
right.
And the other thing I want to say is that just because your child may not have a 504 plan does not mean the child is not eligible for services. So that child is still covered under 504, which means the school still has to provide the diabetes care in the absence of a plan. The association recommends the development of a written plan because if it wasn't written, it didn't happen or it wasn't said. So it's always a good idea to have a plan. that clearly outlines all the expectations of the school and delineates all of those responsibilities among the school staff. So, certainly we always recommend a 504 plan.
Definitely. Let's not go into too much detail about what goes into 504 plans, because you have some excellent examples on the website. We'll link up there and people can check those out. And again, you may want to ask local parents what's worked for you, or talk to the counselors at the school who do that, because in my district, again, we really only needed it for those end-of-year tests and some other examples. I wrote out a 504, Crystal, I'll tell you, for kindergarten. That's probably like 10 pages long.
Yeah.
And I don't think that we never needed it, but it was good. It made me feel better to have.
Right. And this actually brings me to another point. I get a lot of questions about, if everything's going okay at school, why does my child need a 504 plan?
Great question.
Well, my recommendation is the 504 plan should be a proactive document, not a reactive document. So let's put it in writing while everything is going well. And let's hope that it continues to go well, because things change, people change, principals leave, school nurses leave. People are always moving. So get it in writing while things are going well. Don't wait for a problem to occur. I'm not saying a problem will occur, but let's not wait. Let's put it in writing now.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful thing to say to people who say to you at school, and it has been said as well, why do you need this? We're fine. And you have to be able to tell them, look, you're great. I love you, but I don't know if you'll be here forever. So let's make sure. And this is my child's right under the law. As you said, it's not just for children with diabetes.
No, it's not. And let me just say one other thing about the plan. It can be updated as needed, because our children grow and they change. That's what we want them to do. They become more independent. So there may be a need throughout the school year to change the plan. So just expect that to happen, especially as the child moves to a higher level of independence in his or her diabetes management.
Great point.
Well, could I say something about the association's resources?
Yeah.
Okay. So the association has a wealth of resources on its website. We have sample plans. We have explanation about federal laws, state laws. We have a page, if you go to diabetes.org/kidswin, there's a drop-down box. You can click on your state to understand the applicable state laws. We have fact sheets that pertain to particular situations, such as, what happens during a field trip? What is the school's legal obligation to provide care during a field trip? So there are a number of fact sheets on the website that are not only helpful for the parent, but the parent can feel free to share those fact sheets with the school, especially if any issues crop up. The other big resource we have on our website is we have a training page. The URL is diabetes.org/safe-at-school-training. And those resources can be shared with the school nurse. There's a curriculum on how to teach diabetes to school staff. There are fact sheets on CGM, and there's a pump skills checklist for school nurses. There are pre- and post test for our training modules. So I would encourage parents to share that link with their school nurse, because it'll be extremely helpful to the school nurse in training teachers and school staff and others in the diabetes management of children with diabetes.
I'm curious, you and I first talked a couple of years back, and as you mentioned, your daughter was diagnosed when she was 1. And is she a young adult now? I'm sorry, I forgot to ask.
She is. She's 28 years old, and she's doing well. She wears a pump and CGM, and she is employed as an ICU nurse in a Northern Virginia hospital. So
Oh,
she's
fantastic.
doing great.
Oh, that's so great to hear.
Yes, thank you for asking.
Of course.
Yes.
Love
we
that.
survived preschool and elementary, middle, high school, and college.
Oh, my gosh. But what's funny is, you certainly were, as you said, you were pre-pump. pre-CGM. We were as well. We transitioned over as Benny got older. We were kind of a family that has seen the big technology changes as my child is still a child. And I'm curious, what's going on at the ADA? How closely do you look at things like remote monitoring, right? A lot of parents that I talk to can't imagine not having their Dexcom Share or Night Scout being able to be used, and that gets written into a lot of 504 plans. It gets written into, but school Wi-Fi, and then we have a whole issue here that I'll talk about more about our school district and employees not being able to use their personal devices to follow children. Can you talk about policy or just how you're looking at it at the ADA? It's got to be a moving target right now.
Well, actually it is. And, things are changing quickly, and we're changing and updating our guidance quickly. And actually we've got a new piece coming out, I'm hoping maybe in the second or third week of August, about CGM and remote monitoring. But our advice, really, we think these are remarkable tools, and we feel like they should be utilized. But to what extent really is the decision between the parent and the school. And I would say at a minimum, in terms of alarms, there should be an audible alarm set for low blood sugar. But in terms of remote monitoring, I definitely think some parameters need to be set in terms of when the parent might alert the school nurse if the school nurse, for whatever reason, is not remotely monitoring. But we're finding that a lot of school nurses do utilize the technology, and that they do like it, and that it does make diabetes care easier. But I think the key is for the parent to make sure the provider is writing any protocols and instructions in the orders, and that the parent and the school sit down and figure out, to what extent is remote monitoring going to be used? When does it make sense for the parent to give the school a call and say, hey, my child's blood sugar is plummeting, or, my child looks a little bit high and I know she's getting ready to take a math test. And again, I as a parent, I say this as a parent, and I understand the struggles, but I think we have to be reasonable, because there are a lot of competing priorities for these school nurses. They have a lot on their plates. And if we're going to be monitoring and intercepting every single blood sugar, the parent then probably needs to become a little bit more involved in I mean, I don't even like saying this, but maybe come to school if blood sugar needs to be monitored that closely. But again, I'm going to circle back and say the parent and the school nurse really should work it out.
Yes, and I think that you mentioned this really close to the beginning where you said, we're a team. And I have found that is the best way to handle it, because you go in angry and ready to fight. That's what you're going to get. You're going to get a fight. And if you go in really saying, let's help each other out, it does work better. I'll talk more about this perhaps after the interview, but maybe I'll get my soapbox out, because I have to tell you, we have had a lot of discussions at our house about remote monitor, about when to call school and when not to call school. And I will say it does help to have a plan. My child is now 13, but starting at around age 6 or 7, even though he didn't have a CGM at that point, we had a plan for major highs and lows. And then we were able to implement it, because I got to tell you, I can't imagine calling school. I can't imagine calling school and saying, you've got to handle this. Oh my God! To me, it just seems so removed. I agree. But if I had a CGM when my son was in kindergarten, maybe I would feel differently. So I'm not judging, but I can't imagine.
No, I understand, and that's why I always say we have to have reasonable expectations. And I don't want to get on my soapbox either, but I'm going to, and just say, as a parent, one of our goals for our children is that they become independent. And in order to become independent, when you're talking about diabetes, you need to troubleshoot. So it's just something to ponder.
Let's leave it there. Maybe I'll talk more at the end of the day.
I will just leave it there.
But in terms of policy,
some who disagree.
Yes, and in terms of ADA policy and what you'll back parents up with, I would imagine, and I may be putting words in your mouth here, but I would imagine that if the endocrinologist will write it up, you'll back it up? Or do you have your own policies at the ADA where, say, if someone calls you and wants legal?
We don't per se have policy. I mean, we issue guidance, and the care is really between the child's provider and the parent and the school.
Got it.
So, our approach is follow what's in the DMMP, and that's our advice. Is if a provider, feels that a certain level of care is needed, that should be documented in the DMMP. And I just want to say, too, that DMMP, the Diabetes Medical Management Plan, or the physician's orders, it's also important because it's in that plan where the level of independence will be indicated and the level of help that any individual student will need to manage his or her diabetes will be indicated in that DMMP. And there's a sample DMMP on the association's website as well.
Great. Okay.
That's an important document.
No doubt. Anything else, any hot topics that I didn't hit that you wanted to make sure to talk about in terms of Safe at School?
Not yet. I really do think the hot topic right now is the CGM. And the newer and improved, and we're seeing technology evolve quickly. We have a group of pediatric diabetes healthcare professionals who guide Safe at School. And these professionals were always coming together to decide, what resources are needed out there. What can we do to make sure that children with diabetes are appropriately accommodated at school? And one of those areas, obviously, is technology. So we are about to come out with some new guidance. So stay tuned for that.
Excellent. I'm curious, too. I should ask about different state laws and giving insulin, that sort of thing, because that does vary state to state. I know you have a great resource on your webpage, but just to be clear, what happens in one state doesn't necessarily happen in another?
That's absolutely true. But with that said, the requirements of federal law must always be met. So if a child is living in a state, for example, where only a school nurse is authorized to give insulin under state law, then when planning for that child's diabetes care, that has to be taken into consideration. So there are many states now, and the association has led the way in the passage of Safe at School legislation in over a third of the states now that allow someone other than the school nurse to be trained to give insulin and glucagon, because those are usually the sticklers, as who's going to be trained at school to give insulin when a school nurse can't be there. And state laws do vary, and some states have stronger laws than others. And I should also say, too, that just because a state doesn't have a specific Safe at School law does not mean that states' school staff aren't allowed to provide diabetes care, because some states have been doing just fine and really did not need any kind of policy change or intervention. And again, all of the laws can be found on our website. So the bottom line is, regardless of state law, federal law must always be followed, and the needs of children with diabetes must always be met in the school setting.
Hey, before I let you go, let's talk a little bit more about your daughter. I mean, it sounds like she's doing really well. When you look back... Oh,
absolutely.
We love to talk about our kids. When you look
back... I love to talk about my
right?
daughter. She doesn't like it so much, but I like it.
When you look back, what do you think you did that really helped her as a parent of a child with type 1 and as a parent overall?
Well, this is going to be really hard for me to say, and maybe really hard for some people to hear, but every once in a while I just let her experience the consequences of some of her decisions. I think that was very helpful. And I think we just always encouraged her. We were always there if we had to pick up the pieces, but we always encouraged her to be independent. We took advantage of, for example, the association's wonderful diabetes camps. And as soon as we could, we sent her to diabetes camp where she learned to give an injection. I think, too, just not making diabetes front and center. And I know this sounds really cliche, and I hear it all the time, but parents of kids with diabetes, the first thing you say to your child when he or she walks through the door at the end of the school day isn't, how are your blood sugars today? And that's not what your child wants to hear. So our children have diabetes. They're not diabetic. They have diabetes. They just happen to have diabetes. It's not the center of their lives. So I just think even in, the whole family dynamic, and it was challenging, but not everything was about diabetes. And you can't make everything about diabetes. And we really let Devin live. She went to pajama parties. She went to sleepaway camp. Every once in a while, she would have to suffer a consequence of her action of, for example, forgetting to bolus. I'll use that as an example. And that was before the days of remote monitoring, so I would have no idea, no clue. Of course, we'd usually see it at night when she would come home. But we let her figure things out, and we let her be independent. And when we were there, she knew we were there to support her. So I really think you need to let your kid be a kid, and our goal is to always normalize children with diabetes, so we can't just talk the talk, we got to walk the walk, and we just have to let our kids grow because they will thrive and become independent because our kids all grow up. Trust me, I know this.
I love it. That is great to hear as I continue with my journey with my son. And definitely when you're trying to balance independence and diabetes, you see a lot of missteps along the way, but a lot of learning as well. I think that's how he learns.
Well, I think, and then don't, parents should not beat themselves up. It's like learning anything else. There are going to be some failures, so don't beat yourself up. Don't be too hard on yourself, and learn, and learn, but enjoy your children, and go to the beach, and go to the park for runs, and don't let diabetes be a limitation on your family fun.
Well, thank you so much, Crystal, for joining me again to talk about this. Again, we will link everything up. There's so much great information on the website, and I really appreciate you going through all the details that parents really want to hear. Thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome, and I encourage everybody to check out the association's website, our Safe at School pages at diabetes.org/Safe at School. And feel free to give us a call at 1-800-DIABETES if you want more information or some guidance on a particular school or daycare situation. Thank you for having me, Stacey.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
More information about Safe at School, and one of my favorite features is the state-by-state listing that they have. You can go to diabetes-connections.com, click on the episode. I always put show notes together with important links for each interview and each show. If you're listening on a podcast app, you can get them that way. If you're on Facebook, which so many of you are, head over to the website to get the show notes. And if you're listening on Facebook, fine with me. But if you want a better podcasting experience, skipping around or saving episodes, sending episodes to people, highly recommend you grab an app. There's a native app on your iPhone. It's called Podcasts. It's purple. You can also ask Siri to just find Diabetes Connections. Same thing on an Android. You can tell your Google Assistant or whatever it's called to find the show, or just grab a podcast app like Stitcher or Overcast, and it's a little easier experience, and you'll see the show notes. But hey, if Facebook works for you, keep listening that way. No problem. I will always link it up. And going back to the American Diabetes Association state-by-state guide, what I mean by that is there's a drop-down menu I'll link up to, and you can just click on your state, and you will see the state laws Who can give insulin? Can your child carry their own stuff around? There's different rules and regulations everywhere, although, as Crystal said, everybody's covered by federal law, but state by state, it does vary. One more quick note about school. I was just talking to a couple of moms of kindergartners the other day, and they asked me, what's your number one bit of advice for starting school? And looking back, there's so much advice that we just went through, but I will tell you two things that I think really did help us. The first is look at the school schedule and make that your child's schedule. We all have a schedule at home, even in the summer when schedules kind of go out the window. We all have certain times of day that we do things with diabetes. You check at this point, you're eating at this point. Let the school dictate the schedule. And unless your child has other health issues, that may need to be accommodated. But for type 1 diabetes in general, I used to go to the school, look at the schedule, and then figure out when I would ask for blood sugar checks and snacks and that kind of thing. Because generally speaking, and as they are younger, there is a mid-morning snack, there's lunch, sometimes there's a mid-afternoon snack, depending on how long the school day is. There are times to work in blood sugar checks that make sense and don't take your child out of activities. If you go to school demanding that certain times of day are when things must be done, your child's not going to have as good an experience, not because people are going to give you pushback. I mean, they have to check when you want them to check, generally speaking, because they're going to miss stuff and they're going to feel different. And who wants to leave in the middle of, recess or reading time or whatever? So I definitely would recommend that. And the other piece of advice, which I've given before, is make sure your child understands that it's okay for them to speak up. This is so hard for shy kids. I don't have one of those. But a lot of kids, even as they get older, they're not going to speak up about diabetes. They don't want the attention. They don't want to feel different. They won't raise their hand and say, I feel low or funny. This is hard. So I would definitely talk to your child about that. Role play it if you have to. That's always fun. And it's really, well, I shouldn't say it's always fun. Some people hate this kind of thing. We were the weirdos who like it. But it makes a big difference if your child says the words out loud rather than just listening to you tell them what to say. So sit down, take 5 minutes, have them say the words out loud, pretend to raise their hand, play school, and really get them to know that they will never be in trouble for diabetes. I always told my son, if someone's not letting you leave the room to go to the bathroom, or someone's not letting you get your stuff that you need for your low, or whatever it is, do it anyway. Be as respectful as you can, but do it anyway. And if you land in the principal's office, I'll be there and I'll back you up. And it might feel awful and you might be in trouble or think, but I'll be there and I will get you through it. And I am always on your side when it comes to diabetes. It works. It takes a burden off their shoulders because they're worried. They don't want to be different. So that's my advice. And let me know what works for you. Love to hear your school advice. All right. This week in our Know Better segment, I want to let you know about shelf-stable Glucagon. We've been waiting for this, and now it is in front of the FDA. Know Better is brought to you by No Foods. And at No Foods, they say good is never good enough. The mission there, eat better, feel better, and be better. These are lower carb versions of your favorite snacks and no grains. No gluten, no sugar. They are perfect for really a range of lifestyles, low carb, keto. We don't eat that way, either of those ways in our house. And I enjoy No Food because I'm gluten free. And it really has helped me. The chocolate chip waffles are Benny's favorite. I like the little muffins. The cookies now come in a couple of sizes, which is great because I've talked about how big the cookies are before in the past. And now they come in a smaller, I think they're calling them a snack size. So check it out. Go to No Foods. You can find out more by going to diabetes-connections.com, clicking on the No Foods logo, and use the promo code Stacey10 at checkout to save. Interesting timing on this one. I just spoke to the people at Lilly about their nasal glucagon, which is in front of the FDA. So you'll hear that interview most likely next week, unless things get pushed around a little bit, but that interview is coming up. The information is that Lilly has submitted nasal glucagon to the FDA and is waiting for its approval. This was called leucemia a couple of years ago. It's been around for a long time, lots of trials on this one. And the upshot is you, no pun intended, you spray it up your nose or up the person who needs it, who is, passed out or very, very low and needs a glucagon rescue. And it is pre-measured. You can't mess it up. The person doesn't even have to inhale. It is just absorbed through the nose. And it is in studies shown to be much easier to use than the glucagon shot. So you'll hear that interview coming up. Today, I want to talk to you about the ready-to-use glucagon pen that just went to the FDA. And this is a big deal because if you have a glucagon pen at home right now, it's a kit and you have to mix it before you can inject it. It just makes it more complicated, right? It's another step to a process that is already very stressful, right? You're already freaking out. And then you have to mix this and then give a giant shot. So this would basically take that step away. So what happens when you give a glucagon shot? Let's back up and just talk about that for a minute. When you're injecting glucagon, you are not injecting sugar. That's a common misconception. I've heard that a lot. But really what's happening in very much layman terms is that when glucagon is injected, it stimulates the liver to convert stored glycogen to glucose, which is then released into the bloodstream. So you're telling the liver, and this is an important function of the liver, that there is an emergency, we need glucose, and it kicks it out. So very important to know what's going on when glucagon is released into the body. And the company here, I'm not sure I'm saying this right, Xeris Pharmaceuticals, they have submitted a ready-to-use glucagon pen to the FDA for approval. Now, this would become the first room temperature stable liquid glucagon on the market. It would eliminate a step, right? You know, if you've got that kit at home, that you are supposed to open it up, mix it, then fill the shot, and then give the person the shot. And that's a lot of steps in a very stressful situation. A lot of people are unable to bring themselves to give the shot. So any elimination of steps would be really important here. Now, interestingly, there's this little tidbit. When Xeris submitted this to the FDA, they didn't just do it as a regular drug designation. They're using something called the FDA's orphan drug designation to do it. Now, this is designed to encourage drug makers to develop treatments for rare conditions that affect fewer than 200,000 people in the U.S. Now, insulin therapy is not rare. Hypoglycemia from insulin therapy, which would be the designation here, it's not rare. There's probably about 6 million people on insulin in the United States. I think that number sounds kind of low, but that's from the American Diabetes Association, so who am I to argue? So Xeris applied for the ODD designation for the much rarer instances of severe hypoglycemia caused by conditions when the body, just naturally produces too much insulin or fails to use the insulin it produces. So this changes things a little bit. It's possible that they could get fast track status with the FDA because of that. Well, what happens if they get approval? Do we then have to use this product off label? Will they resubmit? So we'll be watching that one. Very interesting. But if the pen is approved, then of course, what happens to the dual hormone artificial pancreas pump system? The pump that uses a dual chambered insulin on one side, glucagon in the other. And a lot of people say that you can't have an artificial pancreas system without glucagon. You must have that to be considered an artificial pancreas. The only company that I know of that's actually doing this is Beta Bionics, the makers of the iLet, the bionic pump, Ed Damiano's company. They've been using Xeris's liquid gluc in their pump in some of their trials now. So they're ready. They know how this works in their pump. It'll be a big step for them. There's a great article on this from MyGlue, a part of the T1D Exchange, and I'll be linking that up in the show notes. It is wild, though, after watching glucagon do nothing, be the same for years and years, and waiting for the nasal spray even to be filed, to now have 2 products in front of the FDA at the same time is pretty exciting stuff. So we'll definitely be watching that. And now you know better. Quick note about appearances. I am ramping things up. Already a busy fall, and we're looking into next year already. I just emceed the Bike Beyond event here in Charlotte, where we premiered the documentary about the Beyond Type 1 bike ride from coast to coast. In October, I'm going to Syracuse University to talk to students about podcasting. I am so excited. And I'm currently working with the JDRF chapter up there to do something fun while I am back in central New York. Of course, going to SU and then working in Utica and Syracuse. I spent 10 years in the snowy tundra of upstate New York. So I really am looking forward to going back. And October is such a beautiful time to be there. In early November, I'll be at the Diabetes Mind Summit out in California. Thrilled to have been selected as one of the patient advocates who received a scholarship. So I will keep you posted on that one, the Diabetes Mind Innovation Summit in November. In January, I'll be speaking at the Greater Western Carolinas chapter of their big JDRF retreat. I'm working on a presentation about social media for that one. I've done that in the past, but I'm beefing it up because there's so much great information out there and there's so many pitfalls on social media. So really want to help you thrive using social media, Facebook, Instagram, and that kind of stuff because it's fun to be on there and it's a great way to connect. If you'd like me to come speak to your group, I have lots of different presentations that I do. I'm working on one right now. I'm calling it The World's Worst Diabetes Mom. And I'm going to talk about all of the interesting decisions we've made over the last really almost 12 years with Benny and some of the things that I know have raised eyebrows in some of my mom circles, but how he has turned out so far just fine. So I like that one. It's cracking me up and I'm working on that. But if you'd like me to come speak to your group, please let me know. Drop me a line, Stacey at diabetes-connections.com. And I'd love to meet you. Big thanks to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. And big thanks as you listen. Always so happy to have you here. Please let me know what you think. I mentioned Stacey at diabetes-connections.com. You can also contact me over social media. Best place to do that is right in the Facebook group. It is Diabetes Connections, the group. Great place to have conversations. Do a little bit of self-promotion for you. Once a week, we have our big self-promotion thread where lots of people show what they've been doing and what they're up to. I love that. It's always great to see the good stuff that's happening in our community, online and off, I should add. So jump on into that. Always such a privilege to do this show. I hope the information helps. I hope you have a great back to school. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here next week.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.